before we get into the debate proper, in which I will react to it. Obviously, I can't be moderating this as this is being moderated by ABC, and I'm not yet aware of any live fact checking that will be taking place involving the reporters there. But I will do my best to provide as much context from the electoral side of the debate and its significance. The other thing is, I won't be making any particularly bombastic claims surrounding whether or not I think either one of these candidates are going to be particularly successful or aggressive towards one another, because I don't know how they're going to attack one another since the messaging has been kind of iffy, thanks in part to Kamala Harris's early entry, or rather late entry into the race. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the polling data and why it is so significant and how it might be affected by this debate. So, if I will just really quickly share my screen to make sure it works. So as you can see right here, this is from 270 to win. This is basically an interactive polling measurement site, or rather a electoral map site, where you can basically see and create your own versions of the elections. And basically, what happens in the election, as many of you are aware, is that you need 270 electoral college votes to win. Now, in previous articles on my website, theprogressiveamerican.com, I have talked extensively about the importance of three main states, namely Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And as you can see right here, I've kept them right now as a toss up, similar to what the Center for Politics has had here. Now, I'll go over the polling with these three states in just a second. But the reason we emphasize, or rather, I emphasize these three states is because even if we were to put all three of these as blue and give Donald Trump the rest, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, Harris would automatically win the election because of these states she already controls, or rather will likely control just based off their electoral history. Now, obviously, this isn't guaranteed since the election is still several days away, several weeks away, and there is a serious risk of a flip. And we'll go into more polling overall. But really, really important here, whenever you hear somebody talking about North Carolina or Arizona, as important as Arizona is, it's important to remember that Harris doesn't necessarily need those states to win in order to win the election. And the debate really is going to be about shoring up support rather than necessarily bombarding the opponent into a point where they can basically take a lot of voters away from it. A lot of times these debates are kind of over exaggerated in their importance, and then some people just say they don't matter. The other thing I want to talk about specifically is how the polls have shifted. And then we're going to specifically focus on Wisconsin. Right now, Wisconsin, I'm just going to real quickly replace that. Wisconsin election polls from the New York Times is there is a lot of focus on their polling averages, and I'm just going to maximize this so my screen will go away, but you won't. But I'm still here. So as you can see here on Wisconsin, polling averages, Harris is leading Trump by just 2 points, 49% to his 47. However, as you can see from August 8th, Harris has been leading him consistently. Now, it's worth noting that polling averages in and of themselves do not necessarily matter in terms of how the actual on the ground polling is covered. It just means that these are the ways in which that particular analyst or news organization is weighing all the polls collectively. And if we go down here, we can actually see the different results based around the different polls, based on their quality, based on their methodology, and so on. And one of the things that I really like about the New York Times' approach here is that they actually do a set of lists that distinguish between their select pollsters, meaning those that meet their standards, and those that do not. And for the sake of brevity, we're going to be only focusing on their select pollsters. So if we click here, we see consistently a long term source of momentum for Harris. And while many of them, like for example, this public opinion strategies poll shows Harris only leading by 2 points, another one by Marquette Law School in late July, early August only shows her leading by 1 point. We do see other polls showing her leading by 4, 3, and 6, respectively. Now, another thing that to consider here is that polls are not necessarily predictions; they're points in time that are measuring the public's level of support. So in the case of Wisconsin, it's likely that these polls are showing some level of support for Harris due to enthusiasm, due to her relatively recent entry into the race, but also the fact that her age has made the race a significantly different environment than it was before. So, for the sake of simplicity, though, because of Harris's consistent support and the way in which she has shown a generally stronger levels of support than, say, Donald Trump, I would put Harris in Wisconsin as slightly leaning towards Harris compared to Donald Trump. I'm just going to reset this real quick. So, what this means right now is that at the very least, in the swing states that Harris needs to win the election, she is at least leading in one of them guaranteed. However, if we go to Michigan, it gets a little tighter. So, for example, and I'm just making sure you all can still see this. All right, perfect. You can still see this stuff. Wonderful. If you go to the with Michigan polling, you see a similar environment. However, we also see if with the select pollsters, and I'm just making sure I clicked on the right one. Um, what we see now is that there is a similar environment. Now, there are some considerations here with Michigan. I know there was a significant push with the pro Palestine movement and the non committal movement. I'm just going to make sure that you guys can see this. That might undermine some of these polls. However, I am skeptical to believe that that is significantly influential. And much like Wisconsin, I'm inclined to say that Michigan is still much stronger for Harris than it would be for Donald Trump. But again, since elections are polls, election polls are representative of a point in time, these are not guaranteed. So instead, I'm just going to be putting, for the sake of the 270 to win prediction of where it is right now, as far as I see it, I will be putting Michigan in the lean Harris category rather than a full on, uh, you know, likely or safe Democratic ruling. So that puts Harris in a strong advantage at the very least going into this election. Now, the key state that I have brought up repeatedly is Pennsylvania. And anybody who has watched the Left Coast Live podcast will know that I have repeatedly emphasized that Pennsylvania is the key to winning this election for Harris. Harris cannot afford to lose Pennsylvania. And in the case of Pennsylvania, things are a little more complicated. And in fact, it is quite close. If we go to the polling by the New York Times is at polling average, it gets a little closer. And I apologize for the technical difficulties here. I am still getting used to this new format. If we go to the New York Times polling average, we can see very clearly that because of Harris's dip in the polling averages and just the polls in general, we see that Harris has actually seen some of her lead slip, and she is actually tied in Pennsylvania. Now, there are some individuals who look at this and they assume that this means that Harris is in a lot of trouble, and that is possibly true because a decline in polling is not something that a candidate wants to see, especially before a debate. But it is kind of important to remember not just the polling, but the electoral history of a general region. And in the case of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, they tend to poll together. And so while I would still put Pennsylvania as a toss up, and this is all again subject to change depending upon how the debate performance goes, I would still put Pennsylvania as slightly leaning towards Harris, in part because in 2020 and 2016, all three of those states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all went for Harris. And if we look at their electoral history there, we'll actually see that these states, those three states, almost never go for any other candidate uh, in terms, never actually vote separately from one another. And that's one of the reasons, for the blue wall, I would be saying that insofar as the pre debate environment goes, Harris is in a much better position than most people are giving her credit for. And as for Donald Trump, I am a little more, how do I say this nicely? I don't think he has a great chance of winning re-election in for a second term. I personally don't think that his character or his popularity is all that helpful to any momentum he's had. In fact, in the case of Kamala Harris's message, he seems to only be able to hit on one of two things: either immigration and then just straight up bigotry. In fact, his consistent application of this idea that her being Indian and black are somehow contradictory to one another, most normal people who aren't weird kind of understand that you can be both. But for the sake of looking into his polling chances, I'm going to put up a hypothetical. And let's say that Donald Trump manages to hold on to all four of the states that he needs to have a good chance at getting to 270 electoral votes. And I'm just going to show this real quick again. So, So, as I mentioned earlier, in 2020, he was in a much better, worse position than he is now. But as you can see, if you are leading in Wisconsin and Michigan, chances are you're going to lead in Pennsylvania. Trump is probably not going to reverse that kind of momentum or just any of that historical electoral environment. However, if we go to the electoral college map and look at a hypothetical for Donald Trump, where I don't know, I don't know why that's doing that. That's not something I can control. 270 to win gave a pop up. I thought I blocked that, but it will not. Oh, they're trying to stop me with the ad blocker, so I'm going to turn off my ad blocker and just remove it. There we go. Okay, it tried to stop me with the ad blocker. Oh well. But anyway, so let's say we're going to be very, very generous to Donald Trump, and we're going to focus on this and say that he wins all of these states: North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Which again, he may very well not secure any of that. He still needs to be able to win one of these three states, and the polling right now suggests that he is in no position to do that. And that's one of the reasons this debate is so important. As it stands right now, Donald Trump is attempting to create a clear message about his own reasons for being in the presidency. He needs to be able to say that Harris is not only a member of the status quo, which he probably will say, but he also needs to go beyond the grievances. And unfortunately for him, a lot of his own aides, according to Politico, suggest that he is not able to do that. So that leads me into the expectations for this debate. A lot of people have been talking about whether or not Donald Trump will be able to effectively debate Kamala Harris. And I have been looking at this from the perspective of how Joe Biden handled Donald Trump in the last debate and how disastrous that was. And unfortunately, one of the things I've come to the conclusion of is that Donald Trump wasn't really that good of a candidate. His opponent just wasn't good. It was a situation where Donald Trump was not a strong debater. He was not an effective communicator. He was not an effective person who was able to communicate a clear vision for the country. And I think in the case of Kamala Harris, he's got a younger, more nuanced candidate that is gaining her footing, even if she has to have a close election. And one of the things that I think people need to remember about these debates, especially as it relates to these kinds of messages, is they need to be able to effectively communicate an idea. Basically, a core, quick theme. I'm the guy who's going to make your lives better. I'm the guy who's going to reduce the price of gas, or I'm the guy who's going to reduce the price of your groceries, or I'm going to protect your reproductive freedom. All of those things are quick, snippy, and to the point. And unfortunately, for the last like several months, Donald Trump has not been able to hit on those points. And while I don't think it's going to be a blowout for Kamala Harris, I would not be surprised if in this moderated forum, Donald Trump actually suffers a sort of defeat in this debate. I know David Pakman was talking about some of these issues as well, and he made the point that Donald Trump probably isn't going to get destroyed to the point where his support evaporates. Partisans, people who are already kind of on Donald Trump's side, will probably vote for him anyway. But what matters in this debate is not necessarily getting people from Donald Trump's side over to the Democratic side. What matters is the independents, the undecideds, the people who are uncertain about Kamala Harris's chances at winning or even her value as a presidential candidate. She's still a relatively unknown figure. And while that does work to her advantage against somebody like Donald Trump, it is also worth noting that Donald Trump is a known quantity, and that he can also use that against her by saying, "You know me, you don't know her." And the problem is that is a double-edged sword with him as well. So one of the things I want to also talk about is the rules. As many of you know, the debate kind of got a little messed up with Harris's entry into the race. And because of that, there was a question of whether or not there would be a debate in the first place. Namely, that Donald Trump was actually considering backing out of the debate, arguing that he was supposed to debate Joe Biden. He was not supposed to debate anybody else, and that would lead to a whole snafu of problems. Now, Harris originally actually wanted Donald Trump to debate her on today, and they managed to agree to that. But one of the things they wanted to get clear was the rules about microphones. And that was candidates would be muted when the other one is talking. And Harris wanted Trump to actually be allowed to talk to kind of blow himself up. I personally don't think that's as big of a deal as some people in the media have been talking about, especially because I think Donald Trump himself just does not have the same flourish in a moderated debate style. If he's talking about a set of policy issues, he's going to be vague. He's going to kind of be elusive. He was recently asked at a candidate forum, I think it was, about his plans to basically reduce the cost of childcare. And he just could not answer the question. Period. He was completely unable to respond to any of the questions. He was vague. He brought up tariffs, which have no relation to the price of childcare, and he was just complete and utter failure in terms of his ability to communicate. And unfortunately for Donald, his aides actually seem to believe the same. And if we look at Politico's recent reporting, I believe this was from yesterday, Donald Trump's own aides actually are worried that he might blow the debate. His aides are very concerned about his willingness to get goaded into a sort of insult spree with Kamala Harris, making himself appear more unlikable, unfavorable, and hostile. In fact, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, a Republican and Trump ally, said, "quote I assume she'll, meaning Kamala Harris, come in very, very aggressive, and she will try to bait him, getting very angry, and she'll be personal and try to demean him. I hope, what he'll do is be a guy who's been a real president, while she has been kind of a semi vice president and a guy who knows all the world leaders and a guy who has been through an enormous amount and just be calm and steady and stick to the real differences," unquote. Now, I don't know if Newt Gingrich has been paying attention for the last several years, but presidential is just something that Donald Trump is not. He is consistently petulant, he is consistently based in grievances, and he is consistently hostile to the institutions that are supposed to check him. And unfortunately for a lot of these Republicans, I don't think that's going to change. Now, there's another thing I want to talk about, and that is Kamala Harris herself. One of the things I worry about in this debate isn't so much Trump himself, but how Kamala Harris reacts to questions that put her on her back foot. One of the most famous examples is Kamala Harris responding to a question about whether or not she would go to the border. Unfortunately, she did not handle that very well. She claimed she had gone to the border when she hadn't. And Republicans have kind of used this symbolic presentation of her ability to communicate about the border as a way to say that she has failed the country. Never mind the fact that as vice president, she doesn't actually have any enumerated powers. She does not make any policy decisions. They are insisting that she is the border czar and she has failed to protect the country. Now, obviously, this is partially motivated by their bigotry and their fear of migrants, but this is also partially just because they really, really want to paint her as an open borders candidate, no matter how much the evidence suggests to the contrary. And it's going to come up. Trump's going to attack her. He's going to argue that she was the border czar. She's done nothing for the last 4 years, and that she has done nothing to protect this nation from supposed dangerous migrants. And my suggestion, if I was in her shoes or if I was one of her advisors, would be to remind Americans from purely from an electoral perspective, I'm a lot more open on the issue of the border than either of these candidates will be willing to talk about. But from a purely electoral perspective, can't talk today. Uh, that Trump is the one who royally screwed over the country. He's the one who blew up the border deal that they had, a bipartisan border deal in the House and the Senate, and because he wanted to secure his ability to run for president, to use immigrants, migrants, people of color especially as political tools for fear, hostility, and just ramping up anger towards people who he deems as dangerous. And if she's able to quickly respond to that and do that in a way that communicates very, very clearly that he has no policy, he's not actually interested in solving problems, then I think at the very least she will have defanged Donald Trump's main attack line, which is that she is the open borders candidate. She is the failed immigration czar and things like that. I hope she goes with that, and I'm pretty sure her advisors would be willing to push that position constantly on her. But I'm not entirely sure if she will respond to that directly in a way that I would do it, or at the very least point out how Donald Trump is completely uninterested in the facts of actual border enforcement and immigration, or in the dignity of people who are already here. It's very unlikely that she'll be talking about things like a path to citizenship, which I really wish was possible to be talked about in these kind of debate forums, just because it's the right thing to do. But for the most part, I would like to see Harris hit Donald Trump on the immigration issue and point out that he doesn't actually care about keeping Americans safe. His main thing is scaring people by using racism and anti immigrant bigotry as a mechanism to control and influence the election. The other thing I would like to see Harris hit on, and I'm looking forward to seeing if she actually emphasizes this point, and that is her role as a prosecutor compared to his convicted criminal record. He is a convict. He is a con man. He cannot be trusted with the reins of government again. Hey Nate, how you doing? Thank you for joining me. He is a con man. He is a narcissist, a dangerous interlocutor. He is somebody who is very consistently portrayed himself as being in charge of the American people's well-being while doing absolutely nothing to ensure their well-being, whether it's in his Project 2025 work, even though he claims it's not, has nothing to do with me, believe me. It's very much right up his alley. Gutting the EPA, failing to protect Americans with proper health care. All of these things are things that Donald Trump has either not solved, will make worse, or will just be under the control of people he puts into power for his own sake. And I really, really hope Harris hits on that every step of the way. This man is fundamentally unfit for public office, and it needs to be reiterated over and over again. This election should not be close, and it takes a really good candidate, and I think Harris will be that candidate, hopefully, to remind the American people that they deserve better than this octogenarian racist. As for some of the final thoughts I want to point out here, there are going to be a lot of people who will, on either side of the aisle, before we get started, because it's a couple more minutes before the debate actually starts, who will argue that this debate is going to be the end all be all of this election, that it will decide everything once and for all. It will not. Debates almost never 100% decide the fate of the election. They almost never decide how the election is going to go outside of a few key states. And there are other things that can counteract it. Elections are multifaceted, they're complicated, and very rarely are there a singular issues that actually decide the election results. Name recognition, donor money, electoral history, demographics, those are all key points in ensuring an election goes one way or the other. And who knows, maybe Donald Trump's convictions will actually hurt him. But for now, it looks like issues like gun control, immigration, the economy, healthcare, reproductive rights for women, all of those things I think are much more likely. And before we get into the actual debate, I'm just going to make sure that everything is going well. Okay, we still have the C SPAN stream. So, I just got a couple more things I want to talk about that are like housekeeping matters before we get into the debate because I think I started a little early. So, unrelated to the debate for just a second here, I wanted to touch up on some of the projects that I'm doing because I have been covering the election. I just haven't been doing it on the channel. So, if you don't know, I have a website called theprogressiveamerican.com. It's a website where I do a lot of newsletter writing. I talk a lot about what's going on in the election. And if you aren't following it now, it's free. Or if you want to support my work, you can absolutely sign up for a, yearly or a monthly subscription, depending upon how you want to go about that. But some of you who do follow it will likely know that I was supposed to interview David Rode from NBC News. That has unfortunately fallen apart, and I am trying to see if I can recover that and see if I can get him on the show to talk about his new book. But I am not super optimistic about that in the future. I am, however, going to be writing a review about the debate that's going on with this debate. And then I'm also hopefully going to get Max Boot from the Washington Post on to talk about his book in relation to Reagan and Donald Trump and how that impacts the election as well. Also, I have a couple more articles that are going to be coming out in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for those. In fact, if you want to go to the website, it is theprogressiveamerican.com. I just redesigned it, and I really hope you will consider subscribing to that. Nate, are you still there? I just wanted to see if you're still in the chat, making sure the chat overlay is working because it's been a while since I've done this kind of stream. just gonna check this real quick. Oh, I'm just gonna show the he might have just dropped off, which is fine. One of the downsides of doing these live stream things with the 270 to win website is there's a lot of ads. You saw that earlier, so I'm just gonna try and see if we can show you some of the other electoral stuff that might happen. Um, Another possibility. Well, oh nope, that's the favorability stuff. Again, technical difficulties every single time. That's okay. So 270 to win. So another possibility, and I want to bring this up since the debate will be starting in a couple minutes, is the possibility of Donald Trump taking Pennsylvania. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not really inclined to believe the likelihood of that Donald Trump secures that, especially because Wisconsin and Michigan are, in my opinion, lean or likely Democrat, just because of the consistency of the polling. He could take Pennsylvania, but I highly doubt that. However, if he does take Pennsylvania, then geez, these ads are ridiculous. Kamala Harris would either need to win Georgia and Arizona, or she would need to win either Arizona or Nevada and Arizona. So, or she could just win Arizona and Georgia, respectively. So, again, I really want to emphasize it's really important that Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania. It's all going to come down to that in this election. And while they're tied in the New York Times polling average, and I believe 538s as well, it looks like Harris will likely take that state just based on where it is right now. And if there's a shift thanks to this debate, we will maybe see it go in her favor. I would like to believe that if this debate goes well, we'll see in just enough of a shift for her to win that state and effectively win the election. However, if that does not happen, and let's say we have, I wouldn't necessarily say a Biden fiasco because that debate was just historic in how bad it was. If we have maybe a less than ideal performance, then I would highly recommend, or rather encourage people to start phone banking for Kamala Harris's campaign in Arizona and Georgia, just to get out the word that she is running there and she needs every bit of support that we can get because we simply cannot have a Trump presidency again. It is completely beyond the pale to have somebody like Donald Trump run again.